So the theme of this morning's, or the title of the sermon, to which the theme alludes, we can credit to Irene Camp. So at the last Death Cafe that we held here at St. Andrew's, we begin the event by introducing ourselves to the circle, and it's not always the same people who show up. And Irene had been at the first one where 21 people had a relatively lively conversation that ended up taking a direction of getting ready. Right? So, are you ready? Like, just in case you die tomorrow, are you ready? And it was very interesting. There was a woman there, and she had a notebook with her. She didn't have any children. She had a brother. And she said, "This is it, my notebook. And on the front page are all of my accounts with hydro and power and light. And on the second page is my bank account and all of my portfolios. And on the third page, etc." It was a beautiful thing. And the conversation was, oh, my kids, I ask my kids what they want, and they just say, "We don't want any of it. You deal with your stuff, Dad." All right. So Irene came back to the second Death Cafe and said that the first one had given her a lot of food for thought, and she'd gone home and determined that one bag of garbage at the end of the lane every Wednesday wasn't going to do it. That, in fact, she needed a dumpster for the entire summer. And I was sitting there always kind of having my eyes and ears open to next week's sermon, not completely, and thinking, wow, wouldn't that be an interesting sermon title? What needs to go in your dumpster? So, in fact, you don't need to listen to anything I say for the next 12 minutes, because if you're well on your way to doing that work now, that's good. So I thought, all right, where do we go within our sacred text to start a conversation about what needs to go in the dumpster? And it's really interesting, as I've shared this with others in the last few weeks, which people go to the metaphorical dumpster and which people go to the real thing. I'm not sure it matters, but no doubt we all have work to do. So this is an element of teachings of Jesus as recorded by Luke in what we know as the 12th chapter. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Okay, sorry, can we just hark back to last week? For those of you who were here last week, remember, that would have been an impossible reality, right? Family inheritances in that context did not get divided. Older son inherits, end of conversation. If you happen to be the twin who was born 5 minutes later than the oldest, too bad, so sad, all right? And if you were a woman, well, let's just hope that some other guy from another family grabbed you up, right? That's what it was about. So sorry, I digress. But the reason I do that is so that we don't think that we actually know what Jesus is talking about. On some deep level, we can never completely know because we simply haven't got a real taste of that culture. "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to them, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all of my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid for many years, so relax and drink and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves He said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? If then you are not able to do so small a thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? And do not keep striving for what you are to eat or what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying, for it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for the kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." So the context that produced what we know as the Gospels was so very different than our own. It was the Roman Empire. Power and wealth was in the hands of the few, and everyone else lined up underneath. And like I mentioned last Sunday and earlier, even within families, the wealth was concentrated at the top. The firstborn sons inherited everything, and the family, the household that he inherited, had to trust that the head of the household would rule with grace. That's a big trust, isn't it? Jesus was a wisdom teacher in this context, and as a wisdom teacher, it would have been challenging to pin him down. There would have been a tendency for people to say, "Okay, Jesus, what are you really saying?" And then he would simply respond with another parable or another story. We lost so much of this access to Eastern wisdom when Constantine, in the 4th century, established Christianity as a religion of the empire. Suddenly the church evolved so as to mirror the empire. And it was intended initially to be the alternative to the empire, the alternative to getting lost in that very unjust pecking order, and suddenly it turned around and created its own pecking order. And did not then challenge any pecking order. So Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, last week, in suggesting that the Bible's main concern was that the community obey the state, implied that God was really in service of the empire, not the other way around, but that has always been the case with the empire. Empires always co-opt the gods to serve it. So that the Church of Christendom, the church that evolved from the 5th, 6th century to the mid-20th century, was more or less in service to the empire. And if you disagreed with the empire, for example, if you thought that the biblical text actually was suggesting pacifism, for example, well, not only will you challenge the empire, but you would have found of yourself having to establish another church. That is, if you didn't get killed first. Anyway, getting back to this vast economic inequality within Palestine, that would have been the underlying tension. And there is, within the biblical tradition, and it goes like this. Justice is central to the prophetic tradition of Israel. It is an invitation to create a society that provides for all. The context of the Roman Empire for most Palestinian peasants would have been experienced as unjust. So you have the reality and you have the dream. You have the reality and you have the spiritual inclination. So what's to be done about that? Jesus would have been invited to weigh in on that conversation. Surely, Jesus, you can see that this system that legislates that the older son inherits all is problematic because it ensures, doesn't it, that the land, which was the source of all economic wealth, remained in the hands of the tiny few. So when the question arises from the crowd in regards to dividing the inheritance, Jesus goes deeper because in that context, justice was not an option. You could try and revolt against the empire, and Palestinians did try over the years, yet their revolts resulted in thousands of public crucifixions, all meant to send the message, and finally, the total destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And so Jesus' teaching in that context had to do with taking people to another place so that they could see their lives through a different lens. And in this particular episode, Jesus, as usual, is recommending a version of the Serenity Prayer. So I think his response would translate something like this. We all know that the rules around inheritance in this culture are not going to change anytime soon. And so it is a waste of your body, mind, and soul to long for what will never be yours. And besides, you can see the other half of it, the games that people get caught up with as they try to manipulate and acquire wealth. Probably that comment's more in keeping with what we need to hear in our culture. But he was speaking primarily to the have-nots. So his invitation is, sorry, you'll never get your fair share. That was not the invitation. That was not what he was saying. It was this: let it go. You will lose your mind with anger, jealousy, or despair if you strive for these things. I get it. It's not fair. But instead, and I think this is where the invitation is timeless, live one day at a time. Trust that there will be sufficient for your needs each day. Do you have a better idea in this world where everything has been clearly divided up? And there's very little room for generosity? And then the subtext, always we have to come back to the foundational teaching, and that is love one another. Love one another so as to create an alternative community where you can depend on one another, because God knows you can't always depend on the householder. And if you're an orphan or a widow and not connected to a man in charge who cares about you, you better find yourself an alternative community. And therefore, the biblical invitation always to embrace the widow, the stranger, the orphan, the one who doesn't have a household. So you create one. Our context is very different. I would be surprised if any one of us here had to worry about where our next meal would come from. And so Jesus might survey our community and say, wow, what an interesting context this is. You guys are drowning in stuff. How did that happen? Let me ask you something. Do you feel safer because of it? Happier? You must be full of trust because you have everything you need. Yes? Nothing to worry about. Right? And so the question for every context is this: what is it that needs to go in the dumpster? What is it that we need to let go of? What is it that imprisons us? And what is it that is a constant source of anxiety? Jesus was talking to a group of people for whom the next meal would be a constant source of anxiety. And yet he's saying, all right, but does anxiety put food on the table? Or does creating a community, is that a better way to deal with your energy? Goodness knows we know about anxiety. I think in our culture, we are masters of anxiety. Masters of huffing and puffing about things we cannot change. And so that invitation to let go is always at the heart of the invitation to live with meaning and with joy. An invitation to lose the prisons that strangle our lives in order to discover the life that we were meant to live. So, let me ask you again. What needs to go in your dumpster? As you consider that during this time for contemplation, let me leave you with a few words. One, a piece of poetry by Kabir, who is a Persian mystic. I wonder what you have been holding on to for dear life. I wonder if it's time to let it go. Or are you afraid that if you let it go, you will fall apart? And my own little amendment, that maybe if you let it go, you will simply fall upwards into the arms of the mystery. Or this one from Mary Oliver called The Gardener. Have I lived enough? Have I loved enough? Have I considered right action enough? Have I come to any conclusion? Have I experienced happiness with sufficient gratitude? Have I endured loneliness with grace? I say this, mildly anxious. Or perhaps I'm just thinking it. Actually, I probably think too much. Then I step out into the garden where the gardener, who is said to be a simple man, is tending his children, the roses.